Alrighty. Welcome back to the Politics with Paul podcast with your host, Paul Rader. Today, we're going to talk about the durability of the American political parties, specifically the Democratic and Republican Party, although with a little bit of history even before how we know them today. So, the Democratic and Republican parties have been around for a very long time. The Democratic Party's existence can be traced back to at least the ratification of the U.S. Constitution when it was known as the Democratic Republican Party. And the Republican Party of today has only been around since the 1850s, and it filled the vacuum left by the Whig Party, which filled the vacuum left by the Federalist Party. But even though it seems like more and more people these days are dissatisfied with the Democratic and Republican parties, including some of their own members, parties are still just as robust as ever, and people gravitate toward one or the other, even when they describe themselves as independent. Not everybody, but a lot of people do. So, why is that? Why are these parties such mainstays of the American political system? Let's dive in. So, it first makes sense to dive into why parties even exist in the first place. And this book right here, Why Parties, it's a dark cover, so it might be hard for you to see, but it's Why Parties by John Aldrich, which is a great in-depth look at the reasons parties not only exist in American politics, but why they are as strong as they are. So first, we need to understand what exactly is a political party. And that might sound like a very obvious question, but one way to define it is that it's a group of people with similar views and preferences that band together to achieve specific goals. And the reason we need to know that is because there's plenty of incentives for people to form these parties. It's generally much harder to achieve your policy goals if you don't have a coalition, especially with what you call pork barrel legislation, which is legislation that refers to projects that only benefit a specific district or several districts. If you don't have a party, there's a lack of organization and there's too many competing interests without a party. And also, the majority party can usually pass whatever bill they want as long as there's not a significant amount of infighting. So, there's a lot of reasons why you would want to get into a party. Also, you form parties because it's much easier to mobilize voters that way. Voters identifying with either the Democratic or the Republican Party often turn out at much higher rates than independents do. And identification gives voters a clue as to what your policy stances are. Now, obviously, not every Democrat is the same and not every Republican is the same. There's variations to how much they support their party's typical platform. But those Democratic and Republican labels give you at least a heuristic to give you a general sense of what they think about things like abortion, guns, those sorts of things. And also, lots of politicians are ambitious. And if you're ambitious, you're trying to climb the ladder, you're not going to be able to do that without a party. If you want to become Speaker of the House or Majority Leader or a whip, in the case of if you're the minority party, if you want to become the minority party leader, obviously you're hoping to be a majority party leader eventually. But any of those kinds of things that you're trying to get to become top or near the top, you're going to need a party to do that. Independents do not get up there. So, even if we were all to agree that parties suck and they must be thrown out with the trash, it's not happening. There's too many incentives for people to join up with a party, and the affiliation with the party is ingrained in a lot of people, whether because it's how their parents were. My mom and dad were Democrats. My mom and dad were Republicans, or because of the friends they affiliate with. Maybe they get to college and their college friends really influence their views a lot. Whatever the case may be, those views are ingrained in them. And not to say that they can't possibly change those views over time, but the affiliation with party is very hard to break. So if you want to get rid of parties, well, don't count on it, basically. So now on to the origins of parties. Parties are nowhere to be found in the U.S. Constitution, and founding fathers did not envision political parties, but they quickly gravitated to them under the U.S. Constitution. A lot of people talk about how the founding fathers would have never wanted political parties, and technically true, but they were also instrumental in their formation. Even George Washington, who famously spoke out against political parties, was unofficially, he was a Federalist. He often sided with Alexander Hamilton, yes, that Alexander Hamilton, uh, as opposed to Thomas Jefferson on a lot of policy matters. Not always, but on a lot of policy matters. So he is sometimes considered a Federalist, even if he never actually declared himself as one. And speaking of which, those original two parties were the Federalist Party and the Democratic Republican Party. Federalist Party being born out of those strong supporters of the U.S. Constitution, replacing the Articles of Confederation, which was the original governing document of the American government. Well, the big reason why they chose to have a new U.S. Constitution replace the Articles of Confederation is because of the need for a strong central government, whereas the Democratic Republicans were born out of those anti-federalists who were highly skeptical of the U.S. Constitution and strongly supported the Articles of Confederation because they were very wary of a strong central government. They wanted the states to retain most of those powers. And now, obviously, under the U.S. Constitution, states do still have a lot of those powers, but not nearly as much as they did under the Articles of Confederation. And when you break down the philosophies of the original parties, you have the Federalist Party. Their strength was in the Northeast amongst the mercantile classes, strong centralized government, including support for a national bank. They were also pro-British in their economic ties, which, looking back way after the fact, that might sound crazy. You just shed yourselves of the British and became a free country away from Britain. Why would you want to tie yourselves at the hip, so to speak? Somebody might see it that way. But they're talking strictly economics. They saw Britain as the more reliable economic partner versus, say, a France. And for them, there was a lot of support for implied powers of the U.S. Constitution, those powers that weren't necessarily in the U.S. Constitution, but at least according to them, inferred by the Constitution to be a power of the federal government. Whereas the Democratic Republican Party, they were strong in the South amongst the agrarian classes. They were skeptical of strong centralized government and wanted more power for the state governments. They were also pro-France as opposed to pro-Britain. And for them, they eventually became supporters of the U.S. Constitution, but they were very much explicit powers of the U.S. Constitution only. They saw implied powers as giving too much power and influence to that centralized federal government. So that was the beginning of the history of the party system. And U.S. political history is often broken up into multiple party systems, and most of these are Democrat versus Republican. There's actually several Democratic versus Republican systems that are considered to be in existence at one time or another. There's not necessarily full agreement as to when exactly these eras begin and end, but there's general estimations. So this first party system was the Federalists versus the Democratic Republicans. Democratic Republicans come to eventually support the U.S. Constitution. Federalists start experiencing a lot of major struggles, controversies, scandals, including the Alien and Sedition Acts under John Adams, the second president of the United States, which targeted those with Democratic Republican views, especially those with pro-France sentiments. Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans defeated the Federalists in 1800, and there was a landslide re-election in 1804, and that really helped to tank Federalist power, along with the Federalist opposition to the Louisiana Purchase and the War of 1812, War of 1812 being with Britain, who Federalists supported having more economic ties with. And there was a lot of Federalist infighting, which included the death of Alexander Hamilton at the hands of Aaron Burr in a duel. Hamilton hated Burr so much, even though they were both Federalists, that he'd rather help his political arch nemesis Thomas Jefferson win an election as opposed to Aaron Burr. So that led to a lot of enmity, although that wasn't the only reason. There was enmity between those two men. And controversy over the Hartford Convention of 1814. Federalists saw a crisis for their party, and eventually moderate Federalists won out over the more militant Federalists, including Aaron Burr trying to get several New England states to secede and form their own nation. And again, even though more moderate Federalists won out with their proposals, the secrecy and potential of secession from the convention led to further decrease in Federalist support, and they would cease to exist sometime in the 1820s. And so for a while, there was only a one-party system in America, the Democratic-Republican Party. But that leads to the second-party system, where the Democratic-Republican Party is then reshaped by Andrew Jackson when he becomes president, and the Whig Party soon forms in retaliation against him. Whig Party was an amalgamation of wildly different policy interests, but the thing that really united them was their hatred of Jacksonian democratic philosophy. The Democratic-Republican Party becomes the Democratic Party, and although the Whigs would win a couple presidential elections, but the winning candidates died shortly into their terms. I guess sort of a foreshadowing of the short-lived existence of the Whigs. William Henry Harrison, famously, only 1 month into his presidency, dies. Vice President John Tyler takes over, finishes that term. Later on, Zachary Taylor wins a presidential election, dies something like 9 months into his tenure, and then is replaced by Millard Fillmore. The thing that would really break the Whigs apart was the slavery issue, which had only become more and more intense the debate over slavery had become more and more intense, more and more toxic. Anti-slavery remnants from the Whigs and the Democrats would go on to form the Republican Party in the 1850s, and the Whigs still were technically in existence when the Republicans started forming, but they would eventually completely cease to exist in the 1850s. So third party system is when the Republican Party is born in 1854 out of a meeting in a little schoolhouse in Ripon, Wisconsin. And the two parties would, obviously it's not the only thing, but they would primarily butt heads over the slavery issue. Their first Republican presidential candidate, John C. Fremont, lost in 1856, and the Whigs still competed in that election, but they weren't really even close to winning. But in 1860, Abraham Lincoln would win. Civil War happens in 1861 to 1865 for various reasons, but slavery being one of the biggest reasons. Contrary to what a lot of people want to say, it wasn't just slavery, and it also wasn't about states' rights either. It was a lot more complicated than that, but slavery was a big component of why the Civil War happened. And this period from the Civil War, and especially in the immediate post-war years in the era known as Reconstruction, in federal government elections, Republicans mostly came out on top, although less so towards the end. They won 7 of 10 presidential elections. U.S. Senate control for the vast majority of the time was also Republican, and U.S. House control initially belonged to Republicans for a lot of the time, but Democrats started to take more of those U.S. House elections, or controlling those U.S. House elections from the mid-1870s to about the mid-1890s. And that's when we get to the fourth party system, where the Republican Party comes to claim a very tight grip on federal government power. A lot of the success in federal politics in 1894, they gain 130 seats in the U.S. House, give or take a few. William McKinley wins the presidency in 1896 and then is reelected in 1900, although he's assassinated shortly into his second term. And they also gained 9 seats in the U.S. Senate in 1898 to hold 53 of what was then 90 total seats, because it wasn't 50 states then. We still have a few states that were territories at the time. The only time of Democrat control in this era that's generally considered a fourth party system, so roughly 1894, 1896 to 1932. Democrat Woodrow Wilson became president from 1913 to 1921. U.S. House control was under Democrats from 1911 to 1919, and then U.S. Senate control from 1913 to 1919. But other than that, Republicans dominated federal politics at the time. And this era was also marked by the Progressive Era, of widespread social and political activism and reforms. And perhaps most notably from those reforms was the 16th Amendment, which instituted an income tax, and the 17th Amendment, which instituted the direct election of U.S. senators. At the time, state legislatures chose U.S. senators. But then you get into 1932, which is the fifth party system, or some might say the 1930 election was kind of a precursor to that. Franklin Roosevelt and the Democratic Party sweep into power in the wake of the Great Depression. FDR wins 4 presidential elections, and that's prior to the limit from the 22nd Amendment on presidential tenures. Ushers in the New Deal. The coalition is named after that. Democrats thoroughly dominate the federal government from 1932 through the 1970s. They win 7 of 11 presidential elections, win or maintain control of U.S. House and U.S. Senate in every election except for the 1946 and 1952 election. You also see the civil rights era and the Vietnam War and the subsequent protest of that conflict. But at the time, which may seem crazy to think about today, but at the time, there wasn't a lot of ideological distinction between the parties. There were a lot of conservative Democrats. There were a lot of liberal Republicans. And this actually led the American Political Science Association in the 1950s to publish a report that lamented the lack of what they would consider a meaningful difference between the two parties. Be interesting to know what the people of the American Political Science Association then would have thought about the ideological distinction between the parties today. But the end of the fifth party system is probably the most debated of the party system eras. There's lots of debate about when exactly the sixth party system began. Some scholars would place it in the late 1970s or even 1980 when Republican Ronald Reagan won his first term as president. But in any case, the seeds for it began back in the late 1960s when the party started becoming more ideologically distinct, more of what you see today, particularly with Republican Barry Goldwater's 1964 presidential bid against Lyndon B. Johnson. Unsuccessful, but he really hammered home his conservative philosophy, influenced conservatives for generations to come. There was a realignment of Southern Democrats that started to begin where they started shifting into the Republican Party, and coalitions started to take their time to really sort out into the parties that you see today. Whereas in previous elections, you saw these coalitions form a lot more quickly. This one was much slower. And you also saw the religious right become a political force, especially in the 1980s. And one of the things that really distinguishes the sixth party system from the several previous ones was the fact that control between the Democratic and Republican parties was fairly even. Democrats had their fair share of success. Republicans had their fair share of success. So now that leads into some debate about whether we're now in a seventh party system. Did the election of Donald Trump in 2016 usher in a new party system with a more durable change in the coalitions of the two main parties? Probably not going to know until later on down the road. It's hard to know when an era is fundamentally changing for an extended period when you're in the middle of it. But if Trump loses in 2024 and his general philosophy starts to lose favor across the Republican Party in the years to come, it might be hard to argue that we're in a seventh party system. But again, it's going to take a little while before we can really say for certain. You gotta have a bit of a hindsight is 2020 kind of mindset there. So we might be in the seventh party system now, might not be, depends on who you ask. So we talked about how the Federalist Party ceased to exist, and the Whigs filled that vacuum. They would cease to exist. And then the Republican Party came into existence, and they've stuck around, and the Democratic Party has been around this whole time. So why have the Democratic and Republican parties in particular been so durable, besides the aforementioned incentives to forming them? Well, one of the reasons is that they become increasingly effective at building up party operations. The Democrats and Republicans have state and county affiliations in every state and county or county equivalent, in the United States, and they have very sophisticated infrastructures for reaching out to and mobilizing these voters. Back in the very early days, didn't exactly have that kind of thing. Didn't have these well-oiled machines of mailing out to voters or TV advertisements, those sorts of things. You didn't really have that in the very early days of the US and even in the early days of the conflicts between the Democratic and Republican parties. But over time, those kinds of operations built up, and now you see what they are today, and they're very well oiled machines. But you also have what's known as Duverger's law. It's not an actual law, it's more of an axiom, I guess. But basically, political systems with single member districts and a plurality voting system tend to favor two parties. Or, in more layman's terms, if it's just one person who gets the most votes wins, it's typically going to be two parties that duke it out for that seat the vast majority of the time. You contrast that with places like a lot of European countries that have proportional representation systems that use multi-member districts. Multiple people can win a seat in a district based on how much of the vote that party wins, instead of being a winner-take-all scenario where it's just the one person that wins and everybody else gets nothing. Whether that's the better way to do things or not, that's up to you to decide. We're not trying to get into the debate about that. But Duverger's law basically says, in the case of a system like American politics, typically it's going to be two parties duking out. Not that other parties can't contend for a few seats here or there. They're not going to be a potent political force, at least not for an extended period of time. And then also you've just got basic voter psychology. Typically, especially those in-group, out-group dynamics. My group is great. Your group sucks. Or even they might think their group sucks, but they don't say that out loud to other people. They're too busy being antagonistic to other groups. And it's ingrained in all of us. There's a desire to want to be part of a group. So it happens to all of us. But even amongst Democrats and Republicans, many of them vote against the other party instead of for their own. And so we all have a little bit of that in-group, out-group dynamic. It's about whether we actually recognize that and try to correct that a bit. But you see that a lot in politics. And in the case of Democrats and Republicans, you see a lot of that in-group, out-group dynamic. And it helps to have really kept the conflicts between those two going. But another thing to consider when we're talking about durability of the parties is we have several contexts that we consider. And political scientists typically think about it as party and electorate versus government versus organization. Party and electorate, party and government, and party and organization. Now, it's typically Democrats versus Republicans in all those contexts. But when we say party and electorate, we're talking about the voters. Party and government is elected officials, and party and organization is talking about those party entities at the federal, state, and local levels that work to get their voters to turn out and get their candidates elected. So Bexar County Republicans, Orange County Democrats, Texas and New York, respectively, in those cases. Those kinds of entities that aren't actually elected officials, and they're not just regular voters. The ones who are actually on the ground trying to get their candidates elected, that's party and organization. Now, again, it's typically Democrat versus Republicans in both of those, or in all of those contexts, but party might be weak in one context, but strong in another. And by that, we just mean weak as in the ties to parties might not be as strong in comparison to another context. So, for example, we see more and more independents, self-identified independents in the voting population. So we can argue that the party in the electorate is weaker, but we see very few independents in elected office. So we see a lot of strength in party and government. And also the strength and durability of these parties can and often does differ in the context of federal versus state level politics. So Democrats are quite strong in Maryland, but they're pretty weak in Wyoming. Republicans are quite strong in Florida, but they're pretty weak in Hawaii. They just all have their own different strongholds, and then how strong the parties are in the electorate versus organization versus government can still differ for each of those states. Or even, getting into the weeds a little bit further, the strength and durability of the parties can differ based on localities, cities, counties. So a lot of this has focused on the Democrat versus Republican conflicts, but what about independents and third parties? How have they factored into the system? So I am going to shamelessly plug my own book. This is actually an old cover. The cover is different now, but Why Independents Rarely Win Elections and How They Can Become More Competitive. It talks about a lot of those ways that independents and third parties factor into the system. And by in this context, independents being those who don't have a party. So people who don't have a party and third parties, how have they factored into it? So some tidbits from the book is that third party elected officials used to be much more common in the US. They're a lot less common post World War II, but some state governments still have a surprising number of independents and third party elected officials. Vermont has the Vermont Progressive Party, which would otherwise probably be Democrats, but they are still their own party. Maine's also got a lot of, well, not a lot, but they have a fair number of independent or third party elected officials, much more than you would see in most other states. But independents and third parties have been increasingly hampered by election laws over time, which has strengthened the Democratic and Republican parties. One way that independents and third parties have been hampered is that independent candidates often have much tougher ballot access hurdles to even make themselves an official candidate. And when we talk about ballot access, we're talking about the laws that govern how a candidate even gets on the ballot in the first place, to have their name actually printed on the ballot. So there's two basic ways that candidates get on the ballot. They either have to get a certain number of petition signatures from potential voters, people who can actually vote on that race, or there's a fee that you pay that's however much money depending on what the office is. So an independent candidate often needs far more petition signatures than a Democrat or Republican does, sometimes 7, 8, 9 times as many signatures. And in the case of money, oftentimes that fee is not even available. Or if it is, it might cost more than it would for a Democrat or Republican. And then in the case of third parties, they need a certain amount of support in petition signatures to become a ballot qualified party. Ballot qualified mean candidates on the ballot can actually run under that label. So if a Libertarian party in a state is ballot qualified, that means people can actually run under that Libertarian Party label. But that's not always the case. Not every state has the Libertarian Party as a ballot qualified party. But that's the most common third party. And then you also see a little less common, but the Green and Constitution parties would be the next most common third parties, and they face similar hurdles as well. But independents aren't always middle of the road. And by independents, in this case, I'm talking about people who don't identify with the party. Examples being U.S. Senators Bernie Sanders of Vermont and Angus King of Maine, both caucusing with Democrats, oftentimes voting on Democratic lines. And in many cases, independents and third parties are simply seen as spoilers, quote unquote, who siphon votes off from either the Democrat or the Republican candidate, or both. And a lot of that is because of Duverger's law. And then even when non-party or third-party candidates have made some noise, they tend to fizzle out pretty quickly. Ross Perot in 1992 made a very strong push, didn't win any electoral votes, which is what you really need, but he did win, I want to say 20 million popular votes. Ran again in 1996, didn't have nearly as good of a showing. Third parties over the course of American history have sometimes made fairly strong pushes for the presidency, but in the next presidential election, they're either completely gone, nowhere to be found, or they have a paltry level of support compared to what they had previously. Probably the most successful third party candidate was when Theodore Roosevelt ran back in 1912 because he was dissatisfied with his former protege, William Taft, didn't feel that he was progressive enough. So after Theodore Roosevelt left office in 1909, he comes back to try to take down William Taft, and the amount of support that he siphoned off from Taft is the biggest reason why Woodrow Wilson, a Democrat, became president and was also a progressive himself. So, but other than that, Teddy Roosevelt's Bull Moose Party, they were strong in 1912. I don't know if they even competed in 1916. I don't remember. I'd have to check that again. But even in those kinds of cases, third parties and non-party candidates, their ability to meaningfully contest an election is often short-lived. So that leads us to the future of American political parties. Again, you're never going to get rid of the political parties, even if we all agreed that that was for the best, or if we could say objectively parties need to go. It's not going to happen, especially the Democratic or Republican parties. There will be third parties that come and go, but there's too many incentives for people to form parties. There's too many incentives to join the Democrat or the Republican Party. They're too ingrained in the political culture at this point. And even if you attempted to get rid of them, there's First Amendment concerns. It's a matter of free speech, of petition, of assembly. Those five, well, not so much the religion part, but freedom of press, religion, petition, assembly, speech in the First Amendment, those would all be a concern if you were to actually try to get rid of the parties. If there was a meaningful, or not a meaningful, but if there was an actually strong push to get rid of the parties, you run into all those issues. And one might say, well, look at how many people have a negative opinion of those parties, even people within those parties. Surely they're going to break at some point, but they haven't yet. And they still often get a lot of support from people who have the mindset of the quote unquote lesser of two evils. And some of these people are Democrats or Republicans, but they just don't want to admit it. So parties are going to be around for a long time. Now, maybe they'll become weaker. And it's not to say that independents and third parties can't win elections. They do. That's why my book is Why Independents Rarely Win Elections. But there's a lot of things that need to change for them to be more consistently competitive. So for the foreseeable future, it's the Democrats and Republicans that are going to keep duking it out for the vast majority of elections. So they are quite durable, regardless of how negatively people view them. So, but in any case, that's it for today's episode. Thank you so much for listening. As always, going to end you off on a random question of the day. And that random question is, are Pop-Tarts good? Now, I'm under the impression that I have an unpopular opinion about this because anytime I hear about them, people talk about how great Pop-Tarts are. But I'm just going to say it. Pop-Tarts suck. Now, to be fair, I haven't had a Pop-Tart in a while, but I found them incredibly bland and dry, regardless of how they're made. I really do not get what the big deal about Pop-Tarts are. Now, if this debate might not mean anything unless you're a younger person. Well, Pop-Tarts have been around for quite a while, so it probably doesn't really matter that much about what your age is. But I think that they're grossly overrated and that they're gross. But, it's at the end of the day, obviously, it's about your tastes, and tastes are subjective. Unless they're my tastes, which are obviously objective and completely correct. And if you don't share them, you're wrong. Of course, I don't actually mean that. Or do I? Anyways, that's enough for today's episode. Once again, thank you so much for listening. You can find me on Facebook, Paul Rader, author and speaker, LinkedIn, Medium, If you want to book me on your own podcast, I have a profile on Matchmaker FM and my website, paulrader.org. And I have more information about that media and the actual links in the description in the episode. Please like, comment, subscribe, and share these episodes with people you know. And I think that's it. So once again, thank you so much. And until next time, take care.